Hello, Dinuba Presbyterian Church, and welcome back to our online video Bible study. Happy 2021 to you. We're kicking off this new year with a new series of studies on the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul. The study will last 7 weeks and will take us all the way up to the beginning of the Lenten season. We'll be studying the biography of the Apostle Paul, both before his conversion on the road to Damascus and afterwards all the way through to his martyrdom in Rome. We'll survey all of the books of the New Testament that are attributed to him. And in a few weeks, with the help of an obscure but brilliant biblical scholar with roots right here in California's Central Valley, who we'll talk about a little bit more later on, we'll attempt to sequence those letters, to date them, and identify about where they should fall in the narrative of Paul's missionary journeys and activity that's recorded for us in the book of Acts. So stay tuned for that. That's coming up in a couple of weeks. I'm really excited about this study and to share it with you, so let's get started today with an introduction to the study of the Apostle Paul, and by asking ourselves what might be a fairly obvious question. Why should we study him? Well, I'd like to offer 3 answers to that question, 2 of which are very straightforward and very obvious, and one of which is a bit more complex and a bit more intricate. First off, chances are that if you have been studying the Bible for really any length of time, or if you've been going to church and hearing sermons for any length of time, you have heard the writings of Paul. He's a prolific author in the New Testament. We believe that he wrote about 2/3 of the New Testament, if we're looking at total word count, although it's important to acknowledge as we begin this study that there is some dispute over the authorship of some of the books that are signed Paul. This is kind of the theology nerd equivalent of the English nerd debate over whether or not Shakespeare wrote all of his plays. In the ancient world, the practice of pseudonymity was fairly common. In deference to the style and the prominence and the impact of a particular writer, other writers would sincerely imitate that voice in an effort to amplify it, and often would sign the name of that favorite writer to their document that they created instead of their own name. For instance, if I were to write a sermon and publish it under the name Celseneca Nazarius, this would not have been considered bad form or academically contemptible in Paul's age. And so scholars continue to debate whether or not all of the books of the New Testament that we attribute to Paul were actually written by the Apostle Paul instead of by another Spirit-inspired author who really admired him or who had been really impacted by Paul's earlier writing. But even the stingiest and most conservative opinions in this debate say that he wrote at least 7 New Testament books, which is still a very significant number that's worthy of our attention and our admiration. Now with that, we're going to put aside the issue of pseudonymity, and we're going to treat all of the books in the New Testament that are signed as Paul as actual Pauline writings produced by the same person and by the same mind. But just know that this debate is ongoing, so if you ever on your own dive deeper into Pauline studies, you're very likely to encounter this question. So you can't say that I didn't warn you about that. So that's the first and most obvious reason why we should study the life and the writings of Paul, because so much of the New Testament is made up of his writings. But a second and related reason is also pretty self-evident, and that's his colossal impact on the spread of Christianity in the first century, and his mission to include the Gentile nations into the Christian church. Without Paul's obedience to God's call to reach out to non-Jewish people and welcome them into the faith, you and I may not be sitting here today speaking about Jesus and following after him. You and I are just some of the more recent results of Paul's missionary project that are the subject of a large portion of the book of Acts, chapters 13 through 28 to be specific. Paul appears before chapter 13 in Acts, of course, in both villainous and heroic ways, but he occupies the vast majority of the Acts narrative after this shift in chapter 13. And only the Apostle Peter is more important to this early church history that was put together by the faith's first quasi-historian, Luke. Actually, there's some tension recorded in the New Testament between Peter and Paul, some of it over Paul's mission to bring Gentiles into the church. Paul mentions this dispute in Galatians 2 in no uncertain terms, saying that he opposed Peter to his face and that Peter stood condemned for wanting to regulate Gentile participation in the church. For his part, Peter is a bit more measured when he writes about Paul, and he mentions the Apostle Paul in 2 Peter chapter 3. He notes that Paul's letters are, quote, hard to understand. Whether or not this was a backhanded compliment, we can't be sure, but we do know that Peter and Paul were eventually in agreement that the church should become a multinational and multi-ethnic gathering of those who follow the way of Jesus. The importance of Paul to his contemporaries in the church cannot be overstated, and that's a big reason why he's worthy of our study in this series and really throughout our lives as we study the Bible. But there's a third reason why I think the Apostle Paul is so important for us, even though almost 2,000 years have passed since he wrote his letters. This reason is a bit more subtle and less obvious. And though many don't realize it, the writings of the Apostle Paul have had a major impact on our history and our culture. Fruitful interpretations of his letters have led to abundant good, but corrupt and false interpretations of his letters have led to some of the greatest evil that humankind has experienced in the last 100 years. Before we go too much further with this idea, let's take a look at two examples of this from history. One from the 16th century and another from the 20th century. One is good and one is evil. And interestingly enough, both examples take us to Germany. In the early 1500s, Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony, was working to increase the prestige and the stature of his particular corner of Germany in the eyes of the greater Holy Roman Empire and the greater world. The Enlightenment was beginning, and several important pieces of writing and sources of knowledge that had been lost to Europe for centuries were being rediscovered thanks to increased commerce and technological change. The path to greater prominence and greater impact in world affairs ran through the university, an institution that Christian monks had created several hundred years earlier, and what was now a critical part of society. Frederick the Wise recognized all of this. After all, he wasn't called wise for nothing, and he decided to create a new university in the city of Wittenberg on the Elbe River. This university still exists to this day, but when it was just getting started, Frederick was on the hunt for talented faculty to fill its ranks. For the university's first dean of its School of Theology, Frederick appointed a young, anxiety-riddled monk from Eisleben with chronic stomach problems named Martin Luther. He saw something in Luther's voracious capacity for learning and his devotion to faith and to the truth of the Scriptures. And even though Luther didn't yet have his doctorate degree, he was hired anyway on the promise that he would complete his doctorate very shortly. And of course, Luther did. And as he taught and studied at the University of Wittenberg, he became particularly interested in the writings of the Apostle Paul. The rest, of course, is history. But Paul's understanding of the faith of Jesus being the fulfillment and thus the end of the Mosaic Law was instrumental in Luther redefining the relationship between faith and works and reintroducing the idea of justification by faith alone that sparked the Reformation. The Reformation helped to end abusive practices of the church like papal indulgences that gave license to the rich who could afford it and brought suffering to the poor who could not, and obscured the true meaning of the gospel. The Reformation accelerated political change and eventually led to religious migration out of Europe and into the New World, migration that created our country of the United States. The Reformation is Luther's legacy, but it also belongs in no small part to the Apostle Paul, and great good has come out of Luther's understanding and study of Paul's writing. Now, the second example from the 20th century is really quite the opposite. And though this example also runs through Germany, it begins in the city of Jerusalem, in the early 1950s. The British had withdrawn from this area of the world in 1948, and the ensuing war between Arab nations and the newly created Jewish state of Israel had resulted in Israeli borders that did not include Jerusalem. The holy city itself was fully inside the borders of the state of Jordan, but was administered by the United Nations and connected to Israel via just one highway. Jerusalem, the city of peace, was fraught with tension and uncertainty, and was a bureaucratic nightmare for everyone who lived there and everyone who was involved. Nevertheless, the city remained one of the premier places in the world to study history and theology, particularly for Jewish historians, theologians, and philosophers. One such young Jewish theology and philosophy student was a man named Jacob Taubes, who was studying a new frontier in philosophical research that was called political theology. The set of ideas that was called political theology at that time had given rise to the Third Reich in Germany in the 1930s, and by way of that, the Holocaust and World War II. And Taubes really wanted to understand how a philosophy could have gone so wrong and inflicted so much suffering on his people and on the world at large. What were the underpinnings of this political theology that had allowed Nazism to rise? The answers he was looking for were contained in a book by a German philosopher named Carl Schmitt. Like a good, diligent student, Taubes searched for Schmitt's books in the libraries of Jerusalem, but the only library that could possibly get the book for him was on Mount Scopus and was under heavy guard by the UN. The Mount Scopus library was notoriously difficult to deal with, and by law, books could not be removed from its premises. They could only be studied at the library itself. The only way to get a book out of Mount Scopus was to offer hefty bribes to United Nations soldiers who would hide the book somewhere on their person, walk out of the library, and then hand it to you after you had handed them a very large sum of cash. As a mere graduate student living in a famously difficult city, Taubes did not have enough money to bribe the UN guards to get the book. But he was resourceful, and when word reached him that the committee that was working on the first draft of the new Israeli Constitution were also interested in getting a hold of Schmitt's book, he connected himself to that deal to import the book into Israel and got himself a copy. He began to read Schmitt's philosophy of the German state under Hitler. Schmitt believed that in the modern world, the social forms and psychological rituals of religion that had once been exemplified by the Roman Catholic Church now belonged to the all-powerful state. That is to say, where religious belief had waned in Western society, the state had stepped in to fill that gap in people's lives and in their hearts and in their moral imaginations. To Taubes' surprise and to his dismay, Schmitt justified this idea by pointing to the writings of the Apostle Paul, specifically his discussion of the state in Romans 13, verses 1 through 7, where Paul says that the state does not carry the sword in vain, and that it was placed in authority by God, and that we should be subject to those authorities that God has placed in power. Even worse, Schmitt took Paul's discussions about the nature of the law, Israel, and Jesus, particularly Romans 9 through 11, to mean that the church had supplanted the people of Israel and replaced them as God's chosen ones. If the church had replaced Israel and the state had replaced the church, this meant that the state was a supremely powerful agent that could remake the world. Schmitt's misinterpretations of the Apostle Paul were cataclysmic, providing an intellectual, academic, and philosophical lattice on which grew the poisonous ideology of Nazism. This ideology grew so strong that it tried to exterminate Jacob Taubes' people and succeeded in killing millions of Jews across the world before the Allies were victorious in World War II and put an end to that regime. Taubes became an influential philosopher and academician in his later life and eventually exchanged several letters with Carl Schmitt about these topics, managing to soften Schmitt's position and open up the possibility that Schmitt had misinterpreted the meaning of what the Apostle Paul was trying to communicate in his letters. What this episode in history teaches us is that the interpretation of Paul is a very serious matter. His influence upon culture, upon Western thought, upon theology, and upon Christian teaching and thinking is so vast and so immense that getting it wrong can create genocide and war, but getting it right can create reformation and new growth in God's kingdom. That's why, despite the great evil done against the Jewish people by Nazi Germany, spurred on by Schmidt's misuse of Pauline theology, Jacob Talmas remained fascinated by the apostles' writings and by his message. Talmas himself once wrote, "Judaism is political theology. That is its cross, since theology is certainly not exhausted by dividing it up politically. For the law is not the first and the last, because there are even relationships between man and man that exceed, that infringe the law. Love, pity, forgiveness, not at all sentimental, but real. I could not go one step further in my poor and often crooked life, and I have no idea how to go one step further without holding fast to these three, and that always lead me, against my will, to St. Paul." The writings of the Apostle Paul are immensely compelling, even to those who are outside the church community. Paul's message that the good news of Jesus heralds a fundamental shift in humanity's relationship to the law, in turn means a new relationship between humanity and sin through Jesus' atonement, which in turn means a new relationship between humanity and death. Love, grace, which Talbot calls pity, and forgiveness are the essence of what the law was intended to teach us, and what Jesus fulfilled and brought into our world and into human experience. These are profound, weighty matters, but hopeful and encouraging matters as well. As believers in Jesus and as a part of his church, one of our great joys and one of our great obligations is to steward this message written down so long ago by the Apostle Paul. We're called to study it, to wrestle with it, to be challenged by it, and to be changed by it, so that we can share that message with a hurting world lost in a tortured society without love, without grace, and without forgiveness. As Jesus' disciples, we can and we must study the Apostle Paul's writing and do our best to interpret them, because if we do not, the world will do it for us, and we probably won't like the results. So over the next few weeks, let's do just that. Let's study the life and the writings of the Apostle Paul together. Next week, we'll put on our historical and scriptural detective hats once again, and we'll begin piecing together the biography of Saul of Tarsus, from his birth up to the dramatic and life-changing experience that he had on the road to Damascus, as we look for insight into how God uniquely prepared and shaped this first-century man to deliver a message for all time. I hope you'll join us then. Until next week, the Lord bless you this week, and we'll see you next time.